It's always fun when a video game gives you some level of choice. I've always been absolutely obsessed with games that have a creation aspect to them, like Little Big Planet, The Sims, Animal Crossing, Minecraft, Stardew Valley, things of that nature. Even games with just character creators like Baldur's Gate 3 I find incredibly enticing. Despite being from various genres, these are all contingent on player choice, and it's a huge factor for why I spend hours on these games, always returning to them and rotating between them for years on end. But there's honestly a specific flavor of player choice that I've always found to be incredibly fascinating, something that the previously listed Baldur's Gate has, and even to a much lesser degree, Stardew Valley. It didn't exactly have to be fancy with it. Let's get to the point. You saw the thumbnail, you saw the title, you know what I'm talking about already. I love factions in video games. Hello again, monsters and mechanoids, I'm Strix Prime, and today I'm going to explain why my exact path that I take in an old Bethesda game is the objective best, and why you shouldn't pick anything otherwise. Just kidding, I'm not going to reduce everything just to that, unlike some internet spaces. Anyways, for your viewing pleasure and for the sake of my inherent need to hyper-organize, I've consolidated my points into categories. In literature and movies, the roles of both the protagonist and the antagonist of a story are usually well defined. In all forms of media, you have many techniques for making a reader, or viewer, invested with certain characters or alignments. With video games, however, this can be done to an even greater extent, inserting you directly into the situation and allowing you to choose how conflicts unfold, as well as your place in the game's universe. You obtain a level of agency that is not typical for the average person in real life, which is a huge part of the appeal. Obviously, protagonists and antagonists are very much still a thing in video games. The core difference is that the faction system allows you to pick and choose who is with you and who is against you. I mean, I'm assuming that most of you understand that these choices are not necessarily defining who is good or who is bad. Take, for instance, Kira in Death Note. He's the story's protagonist, but he's not exactly supposed to be the good guy. But the game developer might still have an intended protag and antag. I mentioned Bethesda games a while before. When most people think of factions in video games, a lot of people recall games like Fallout New Vegas and its faction system. It's pretty apparent in New Vegas that your intended protagonist faction is the New California Republic, or the NCR for short. It is your standard, lawful good faction. It is probably the most normal and conventional faction out of the choices that you get. They have their own flaws, but their intentions are good. They're not really inclined to immediately hurt anyone, and despite its barely functioning bureaucratic slowness that the game well establishes, it's the most stable option for you to pick for the future of the wasteland. They expect the standard player to pick it, at least on your first run. Meanwhile, while there are a multitude of factions to pick in the game, it's very clear that your main antagonist is supposed to be the Legion. They kill without question. The society they run is chaotic, largely unorganized, and even hurts its own people. It's not exactly made to last, at least from an outsider's perspective. It's held together by sheer strength over thought. It's clearly illustrated when you first step into Nipton. The music suddenly becomes eerie. Corpses are dangling from crucifixes, and the town is left completely barren save for the Legion, who is just finishing up their rampage. When you go to talk to them, they have their own justifications for what they did, but it's very clear. These people are dangerous. They feel zero remorse and will erase you immediately, much like the citizens of Nipton, if you even remotely fall short of their standards. So then, why does this faction, and why do so many others like it, and countless other games, appeal to people? Why do all the other factions of the game have their respective fans, despite all of them having their own flaws, intended protagonist or not? Why are you given a choice between them if some are practically confirmed to be the bad guys of the story? Usually, when people discuss factions, they tackle them first from a story perspective. We'll certainly get into that later, but let's start with our basic advantages to faction implementation. A lot of games these days don't exactly encourage a cookie-cutter playstyle, and Fallout New Vegas is no exception to that, even on surface level alone. When creating your very ugly player character, there's a lot going on here. Various stats that essentially determine the personality and nature of your character, all potentially beneficial to whatever playstyle you choose to adapt. You want to be a smooth talker that generally avoids most interhuman conflict? You pick charisma. You want to skip all that dialogue and brutalize any poor sucker who you just happen to cross paths with? You pick things like strength. You want to sneak past that altogether and just break into people's houses to get what you need? Drop those chips into luck and agility. You just want to run away screaming like a coward half the time? Endurance. You get my point. Without delving into the various in-game weapons, there are various ways to play, and arguably, inevitably, the factions that you pick can either enhance or hurt the playstyle that you choose. The brutal nature of the Legion, for example, encourages a more confrontational and violent route for the player, so ideally you want to focus more on combat-oriented stats. Factors that would generally help a more pacifist playthrough here aren't as nearly as necessary. By contrast, you would be more inclined to implement these types of pacifistic stats when aligning with the NCR. You also wouldn't be as inclined to throw your points into stats that facilitate achieving things through more unlawful means, since your lawful good factions like the NCR will punish you for things like theft, pickpocketing, and lockpicking at times. Even if you pick, say, Mr. House. You don't want to cause too much chaos in the Strip, an in-game area that Mr. House is said to have put his entire life into gradually building up almost single-handedly. Though, that doesn't mean you can't get a little sneaky just as a treat. On the other hand, a largely self-serving faction like Yes Man is mostly indifferent to anarchy and its consequences. My overall point being, when looking at factions solely from a mechanical perspective, they often provide greater options for playstyle. There's something for just about every kind of player. Even in games where their faction systems are incredibly basic, things like JojaMart versus the rest of the town in Stardew Valley fall into this. Other than playstyle in and of itself, another big part of faction systems is the cascade of consequences that bar certain story paths or NPC interactions following major player decisions. Games that execute faction writing properly will assign weight to your decisions, whether you are gallivanting around as the good guy or invoke terror as the bad guy. Different factions will offer advantages and disadvantages that can make your life way easier or cause you extreme misery. Perhaps your proclivity for role-playing, affection for your character, or even sheer morbid curiosity will lead you down the road of committing heinous acts that you would otherwise not be inclined to do. Either way, a good faction system forces the player to think and make their own choices, even in situations where the moral outcomes are unclear. And of course, finally, proper implementations of factions in gaming can impact a game's replayability for the better. Unlike real life, you get to look back at the choices you made, and retroactively change them the next time around. What if I had saved that person? What if I didn't help that group? What if I did this or that? You get to go back and truly test out the impact that you have on the game's world. You get to see the same story from different roles and perspectives. By replaying, you can slowly piece together the game's universe. There's motivation to keep coming back to it. So now we brought up our other major function here, the one that everyone loves to talk about. There are multiple ways for video game factions to flesh out a story and make a game feel more like a real place with real people. Fallout's factions help flesh out the game's lore by leaps and bounds. NPC dialogue, text logs, holotapes, and even the visual storytelling help paint a picture of how that faction has withstood the world it lives in, including what they've seen, the events that they've caused themselves, everything. Simply put, these factions provide the magic behind immersion in the world. It's one of the best ways of communicating the story to the player without awkward expository dumps, and incentivizes the player to piece together the lore themselves through their own exploration and gameplay. The bits and pieces that you collect make you want to learn more, and it makes the in-game world feel larger than its own technical limitations may allow. It's one of the many motives for faction experimentation on subsequent playthroughs. Even if you're choosing a faction that conflicts with your own personal morality, it allows you to see things from an opposing perspective, rife with different motivations and beliefs, all obtained straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. An NPC's reasoning for joining a faction provides much needed character development. Why did they choose to align themselves with the group that they're in? What are their relationships with the other people in said group? What ideals of theirs matched up with those of the group that they're in? What interpersonal conflicts might they have going on within their group? Do they truly belong in the group that they're in? And many other questions about their attachment to their community. There's a lot to be learned from an NPC's allegiance to a group that makes them feel less like an NPC and more like a real person. For example, many people resonate with Caesar. Though the game definitely wants you to know that he's a bad person, he makes for a compelling intended antagonist. He explains the reasoning for his choices in a way that makes sense. You learn his experiences, what lessons he chose to take from the harsh world that he lives in, why he organized the Legion the way that he did. It's not that people like him as a person per se, though I'm sure some fans might. It's more that he practically carries the themes that the game wants to get across on his back with how he's written. He's a representation of what some people might opt to do in a do-or-die situation. He and his group chose to adapt to the chaos that they were left in by essentially becoming that chaos. The Legion is what happens when people choose a survivalist mentality, and above all else, demonstrates the same conflict-causing nature that humanity has always struggled to overcome. They are the reason why war never changes, and you only learn the fullest extent of their actions, their beliefs, and how their attitude affects the world around them by choosing their route. When I played the game as a kid and chose the Legion for the first time out of pure curiosity, the ending was gut-wrenching for me. The impact it had on the other characters I've come to love, the areas that I'd grown so familiar with. Even though I was the one who chose to make the will of the Legion into a reality,
oh, look, the consequences of my own actions.
I felt the weight of my own decisions and got to see the fullest extent of where the Legion's mentality would take everything. I got to see what would happen if I chose survival above all else in a do-or-die situation. It's why I and many others actually really like this ending. It's impactful, it gets the point across, and the fact that you, the player, chose to have a hand in how things turned out makes it all the more effective. I've actually met people before who get mad at people for going that far into a Legion playthrough and getting that ending. In some discussions of the game and similar situations with other media, I've seen people even say that these things shouldn't be an option for players. I've seen people, for moral reasons, say that you should intentionally make these types of antagonist characters more 2D and unappealing so that less people can like them or take inspiration from them, so that they don't end up like that faction. And while I can kind of understand their concerns, you do get some interesting people defending the actions of factions like the Legion. For me, and most other people who've tried the route, it actually did the opposite. You get to see firsthand what happens if you make the more selfish choice. You get to directly feel the impacts of what you yourself might put into the world if you stumble like many of these other characters do. You get to explore the game's attitude to the fullest through all of its endings, this one included. So what happens when you choose what the game feels overall to be the right scenario in this situation? One of the most interesting things about the NCR is how they're seen through the lenses of other factions. It's made clear that the NCR is human and has its own flaws to overcome, whether it be their slow, bureaucratic nature, their weaknesses, their losses, and their objectively worthless currency. That in and of itself successfully demonstrates that the morally correct option is not always the easy one, and why other people might be more inclined to choose the various other paths that the game provides. In their ending, you choose to grin and bear a lot of these things, taking the more difficult and, at times, much more annoying route of helping them overcome these flaws. All this work brings you to a much more satisfying ending than the Legion. The stark contrast of these two endings back to back show the player that the path of least resistance isn't always the greatest one, and the choice between these paths in and of itself might show players that while their natural inclination might be to do the right thing, they have the potential to harm the world around them as much as they have the potential to help it. Much like how many characters aligned with the Legion come up with a million different ways to morally rationalize the atrocities that they commit, you, if misguided enough, can end up in a similar situation. Like we see in those endings, and many other endings you might choose in video games, you may be one person in a sea of millions on this earth, but the impact you have on others, even if only seen in retrospect, can be immense and is something that should be carefully considered. Or, you can just pick the route where you eat everyone. You even get a secret perk for your troubles. In short, I love how all the game's endings and experiences within different factions can be carefully pieced together to show a greater overarching theme. I love how they might make the world feel more real, or may make the characters feel more human. And above all, I love how they can make our choices feel like they have more weight. I honestly can't get enough of games with this mechanic, and I hope that now, after watching, you might feel the same. Thank you for watching. I really hope that you liked this one. If you had fun watching my video, I have other ones to look through, and even more releasing very soon. If that sounds interesting to you, subscribe and whatnot. I am Strix Prime, and I'm going back to rotting in front of my PC.